Well, yeah, as Dr. Ralph said, last year I produced a book on Muslim views of the Bible, which was the first 400 years or so of Islamic history. I'm being a bit even more ridiculously ambitious and trying to take in the next 1,000 years in what I'm working on at the moment. So it would bring it right up to today, and some authors that I know, who are living and active now. So I hope I get there. Obviously, I'm drawing not only on my own research, but drawing in the work of many others as well, who've contributed their own writing. And today I'm going to look using that at Ibrāhīm ibn Umar al-Baqai. You see his dates there. He died in 885 Hijri or 1480 CE. So that's where we're going today. I'm going to just look for a few minutes at what you could call possibly the biggest debate amongst Muslims about the Bible, at least before the internet. Obviously, these days things are very different. So yeah, al-Biqāʿī lived in Mamluk, Cairo, and here's just an image to help take us there. He lived in Mamluk, Cairo, and there's a large view, and there's an incense burner also from Mamluk, Cairo. Perhaps just helps us remember that the human scale, he would have been sitting at his desk working out all these things that I'm going to talk about now. So what I want to do is I'll give some brief biographical information, and then I'll explain how in his Tafsīr, his commentary, he uses the Bible extensively, very, very much, more than anyone else at the time. This led to something of a controversy, which is preserved for us partly in his own work and the work of others. And in fact, he ended up writing a separate book defending his use of the Bible as to why it was acceptable for him as a Muslim, and a very devout Muslim, to do what he did. So what do we know about al-Baqai? He was born in a small village in modern Lebanon. Unfortunately, he didn't have an easy start in life. He rose from humble beginnings, fleeing with his mother at the age of 12 after a violent feud in his community, which killed his father and several of his relatives. So he had to flee from what is now Lebanon. And eventually, after some travels, he went to Damascus. But as an adult, he lived mostly in Cairo. Well, he did end his life living in Damascus again. You could say he rose from relatively humble beginnings to a very prominent position in Cairo, and then fell back to very humble endings. At the end of his life, he was shunned. He was not a popular figure. That was not to do with this. He did have a tendency to pick fights, intellectual fights with people. And this is well documented by other scholars. One writer calls him an austere, fearless, and unbendingly Puritan Muslim, which is a good characterization. So that gives you an idea of where he's coming from in his extensive and unusual use of the Bible. He was always on the lookout for infringements of the Sunnah, and considered himself to be someone who enjoined the good and preached against the evil. So his Tafsīr here is entitled Nazm ad-Durar fi tanasub al-ayat was-suwar, or you could translate that, the string of pearls on the harmonious relationship of verses and surahs. He published this gradually in stages. It was based on lectures he gave on the Quran over a 20-year period in one of the main mosques in Cairo. But it did lead to controversy because of such extensive use of the Bible. And interestingly, he never explains what led him to start using the Bible so much. He did have very good knowledge of it. He says he had access to 3 different Arabic translations, both of the Hebrew scriptures and the Greek New Testament. So he was accessing the Bible in Arabic, and he was able to evaluate, some of the different translations. He had one that he particularly liked. Scholars at the moment can't actually work out which one that was, but who knows, might yet happen. So I'll give you a couple of quick examples before we move on to the way in which he defended himself. So for example, he quotes the whole of Genesis chapters 1 to 3. That's the very opening chapters of the Torah or Taurat. He quotes the entire text in relation here to a passage in Al-Baqarah, verses 30 to 36. And in fact, he quotes far more than he needs. That's quite characteristic. We'll come back to that later. And he gives a justification when he does this at this point in his Tafsīr. He quotes this Quranic verse here that you can see on the screen, Surah 393. Bring forth the Torah and recite it if you are truthful. So this is his own part of his own justification for what he's just done. And he uses this big block of text from the book of Genesis to address questions like the creation of Adam's wife and the order of Adam's creation, and when Adam's wife came into existence in relation to Adam himself. He also quotes the Gospels. That's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And again, just a very brief example where he quotes Al-Baqarah again, verse 87, which includes the phrase, "We also gave Jesus, son of Mary, clear signs." And he uses the Gospels to demonstrate or to illustrate, if you like, more of what that Quranic verse might mean about giving Jesus clear signs. This is one of his focal points, that al-Baqai believes that the Gospel verses show the Quran's claims that Jesus was a sign and a man full of wisdom and given signs as well. So as I said, he then, having made that point, he then gives you passages which aren't really essential to his purpose from the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels of the New Testament. Mostly his quotes from the Gospels are in a positive spirit. Occasionally, he will use the Gospels to argue against Christian belief, where he feels that he wants to use the Gospels, but he can interpret them rightly, in his view, or more accurately than Christians do. So, for example, an obvious illustration about the divinity of Jesus. The Gospel of Matthew is his main framework, with other Gospels used regularly. And in fact, he uses the Gospel so much that what he's actually done is created a whole life of Jesus based on the Gospels. If you piece together, and other scholars have done this, you piece together all the passages that he uses, what he's actually done, and I think it's quite deliberate, is to create a whole life of Jesus. But he had probably several, but one particularly fierce opponent in this, another scholar of the time called as-Sakhawi, who was a contemporary of his, slightly younger. And as-Sakhawi was actually asked by someone else to write a very strong criticism of al-Baqai for doing this. And unfortunately, that book is lost to us. It's not been preserved. We don't have it. But as a result, al-Baqai himself wrote a whole book to defend himself from criticisms. He was basically responding to this person. And we have that book. It's recently been edited, the Arabic edition, with an English introduction by Walid Saleh, who's done a lot of work on this particular author. So what was that book called? Here we have, in Arabic, Al-Aqwal al-Qawima fi Hukm al-Naql min al-Kutub al-Qadima. The just words or right statements on the rule regarding quotations from the ancient books. This is the book he wrote, defending his own unusual practice. And one of the interesting things he does in this book is he collects fatwas and other statements of support from all the leading qadis and other intellectuals in Cairo at the time. And we know about these figures because his fierce opponent, as-Sakhawi, actually wrote a very large biographical dictionary. So he tells us about all these people, and he expresses his own surprise that because he didn't like al-Baqai, he expresses his surprise that they made some of these statements. So that's important because it tells us that al-Baqai is not just making this up in his own book. You know, the evidence we have of it is from his own book, but it does seem verifiable that he went round and collected a whole series of supporting statements. So I'm just going to give you a few of those, quote a few of them to give you an idea. So one is from Al-Munawi, the leading Shafi'i judge, and he says this: Al-Baqai was just following the pious ancestors, the theologians and the founders like Abdullah Salam, who was following the example of our Prophet Muhammad, the master of humanity. So, and he's taking that partly from Quran verses, which seem to affirm the Tawrat, for example. And leading Hanbali judge, Ahmad bin Ibrāhīm, he stated this: the work is not to be discredited. This is al-Biqāʿī's Tafsīr he's talking about. The work is not to be discredited by the fact that it has quoted from previous scriptures. We already see support for this practice in the Quran and the Sunnah, and the fact, excuse me, that previous scholars, both ancient and modern, have themselves quoted these books. I'm not going to go into the rights and wrongs and ins and outs of these statements. I'm just giving them to you as an illustration of some of the discussion that went on at the time. The leading Hanafi judge in Cairo was Ibn Shihna. And interestingly, he also quoted the same Quran verse that I mentioned earlier, that al-Baqai himself mentions. And he quotes this verse as part of his statement. And then he says, thus surely to use the uncorrupted parts of the Bible as proof in arguments is the most cogent of arguments, especially since God and his prophet have narrated this to us without stating that it is forbidden to our prophet. And then a much longer statement, from which I'll just take a short passage, is from another leading Hanafi and very, very prominent intellectual in Cairo at the time, al-Kafiyyaji. And he gives a long and detailed fatwa about this. And at one point he comments, it is permissible to quote the Torah and the Gospels in works in our age for purposes like admonition and advice, although it is not permissible to use these two books to deduce laws or principles of laws. So in some of these statements, there are obviously comments, qualifications, limits perhaps to what can be affirmed, which is understandable. But it's interesting that al-Kafiyyaji wrote one of the longest statements that al-Baqai keeps for us. So this gives us just an insight into some of the debate that went on and the way that al-Baqai organized a very coordinated campaign, if you like, in defense of himself by going to all these leading scholars of the day and needing to defend his own position. And it seems that this was one of his more successful situations where, you know, he did carry on in Cairo. He didn't have to leave. He seems to have at least been successful in, if not convincing everyone to agree, but supporting his own position. He, as I said, he did pick other fights completely unrelated to this topic, which eventually led to him having to leave Cairo and go to Damascus, and in fact, live on the outskirts of Damascus because of another controversy. But in this, he was, you could say, almost a skilled politician. He went round, he enlisted support from all sorts of people who were not only important, but were respected as thinkers. It wasn't just that they had power, but they had intellectual weight, if you like. So I think it's a fascinating example of an insight that we get because he preserved all this in a book. It's a fascinating insight into what was going on at the time. Let me read you one more quote from al-Kafiyyaji, which I don't have on the screen. Copying stories and news from the Torah and other works has become such a widespread phenomenon in our time, and it is clear that it constitutes a case of universal tacit consensus, or ijma' sukuti, among Muslims that it is an acceptable practice. And again, al-Kafiyyaji is a careful scholar, and he adds, what was forbidden to copy was parts of the Torah that are of legal content and which contradict our law. So again, there's a qualification there, understandably. So finally, just to go back to what I said earlier, Al-Baqai never explains why he used so much of the Bible, especially given that it got him into some trouble, although it all worked out well in the end. He never actually explains why. What he explains is his justification for doing it in various ways. He quotes far more than he needs at various points. It seems that he was fascinated by the Bible. He doesn't offer any other reason why he quotes sometimes big, long passages of text. He seems genuinely interested. He was not someone who was seeking particular relationships with Jews and Christians. He doesn't address that issue at all. It's just the text of the Bible that he finds apparently so interesting. So I'll finish with a quotation, a different quotation, where he talks about one of the other books from the Hebrew scriptures, the book of Jeremiah, the prophet. And he says about it this, he describes it as a speech sublime in its style, exquisite in its tenderness. It makes the eyes swell with tears. I'll stop there. Thanks very much.